at least in American society, not in countries. And women are taught to be more cooperative and collaborative.
Right. And this is not really what we're going off on, but do you see that changing in society now, those norms that you just described?
I definitely see there's more of a shift to women being more individualistic than they were before and more competitive, and men being more collaborative. And you can see that in, let's say, parenting norms. There are more men staying at home and parenting children than there were ever before. So this is an unprecedented time. And that's just one example. The household balance of how much chores men do and women do, that's also changing. Who is getting more money in a family? Women, many more women by comparison to the past are earning more money than men.
Okay, let me go to the questions here because sometimes we don't get to them and people get upset. So what part, Margaret asks, what part do social pressures play on lying? Is it mainly personality fault to be a liar, or is it something that people feel they must do in order to be socially accepted or to be socially acceptable or accepted? What do you think about that?
Yes, so what the research on lying shows is that we mainly lie because of context. So most of us in the right or wrong context will lie to some extent or other. So there was an interesting study done on students who were given an exam. And there was an exam, so let's say I'm here in Columbus and the Ohio State University, and our big rival is Michigan. So in football rival and so on. So there was one study done on students who were all wearing kind of from Ohio State, and there was one student who was flagrantly cheating on an exam, who was a Confederate of the study. He was kind of placed there to cheat. And as a result, a lot of other students started cheating because they saw him as an example. And so that was one study. Then another study had a student among Ohio State students who had a Michigan t-shirt on. And he cheated flagrantly on the exam, but no other students cheated on the exam in the same study. And that tells you one aspect of why we lie. Who is our tribe? What is the social pressure? So if we perceive that person to be part of our tribe, Ohio State, yeah, go Bucks, then we will be more likely to lie if that person lies. Now, if that person is a Michigan fan, it's like, oh, boo, no, Michigan fan, we're never going to cheat on the exam like those Michigan guys, then they're not going to cheat. So that's one example of the social context.
Right. It's kind of interesting. And again, like a lot of these topics, we go off into other areas. But, you're really touching upon group identity and I think some tribalism. And yes, we know that exactly. the stronger your identity with the group, the more likely you are to take on the group personality as a whole, even if it conflicts with your own personal beliefs or your own norms. And one study I recall, and I thought you were getting to this, it had to do with the college sports. They actually, it's kind of funny, they took socks. And they were labeled, athletic socks from, athletes. They were labeled with different teams of colleges. And, there were blind studies, and they asked people to sort of smell them and judge the odor of the socks. And routinely, people would judge the odor from the other college as worse than the odor from their college. But in fact, they really, that really wasn't the case. They didn't really know what they were doing. Which just goes to show that bias, which I guess we're going to talk about, some of those cognitive biases, which contributes to flawed thought processes, which I think then will contribute to our willingness to lie. Is that a fair leap I make there?
Absolutely. So this is the answering the question of the question that was there before. It's a great deal about our social context. There's a relatively small percentage of people who will never lie, and a relatively small percentage of people who are pathological liars. The rest of us are in the middle, the large majority of us. And whether we lie is determined by social context and cues like tribal identity. At least another interesting cue that determines whether we lie is observation of people around more cooperative. So if we observe a lot of people around us lying, then
there's not
we will
really
be much more likely to lie.
You see that changing in society now?
There was a study done on people wearing knockoffs. I definitely see there's more fashion brands of a shift, and if they knew that they were wearing women knockoffs of fashion brands more individualistic than they were before, they were and more competitive, and men they were quite a bit more likely that in, let's say, parenting and to deceive in other more men staying. So they were prime, and that's one of the things that happens ever before. So priming is one of the time. What and happens in our brain when we are impelled to think about a certain topic in a certain way by a previous context. Who is getting more money in a family? Many more women apply comparison to mentality or other areas of our lives to lying. That's another phenomenon.
Let me go to questions here because sometimes we don't get to them and people get upset. This question here because so what part kind of goes back to something we were saying. Let me pull it up here. What about white lies that end up hurting people? Doesn't allowing white lies lead to the possibility of these problems? Now, I know you were saying that these white lies are not intended to hurt anybody, but couldn't that be a very natural consequence of a white lie?
It could be. So it's certainly not impossible. And by comparison, a black lie could help people. So you don't know, you can't ever predict the consequences, the full consequences of your actions. And this is why, as you well know, Michael, in the trial system, we use the reasonable person standard. What can a reasonable person expect to happen? If a reasonable person would expect the white lie to not hurt someone, that's the standard that you use. If a reasonable person can expect a black lie to hurt someone, same standard.
Right. And I guess I'm just maybe, before I say this, I'm not claiming that I've never lied or I don't lie. I'm not saying that. I'm not making that claim. But I'm just really kind of intolerant of even the white lie because it's sort of what this listener points out, and we just can't reasonably predict whether it's going to hurt somebody because, along with those cognitive biases that you and I love to study, is the way we interpret it, we interpret everything in our own favor. So isn't it very likely that we're going to say, well, it's not going to hurt anybody because that's what we want to believe?
Sure. So to be clear, I myself really am predisposed to avoid even white lies personally for me, because I think that there is everyone that tends to be biased toward themselves, but that's not something that I advocate for because it's really hard to change people's behavior on the white lie front. So I focus my energy on addressing black lies. That's where we can get large, widespread agreement. Let's say 80% of the population, 80 to 90% will say black lies are not tolerable. Maybe only 20% of the population will say that white lies are not tolerable. So therefore, I just don't make a big deal out of them. I prefer to work on an area that I believe can be reasonably shifted and changed, and something that we can unite a lot of people around, which is addressing black lies in our public discourse.
Okay. And again, I'm just, I think about the worker who says, I'm late because of traffic as opposed to oversleeping. Harmless, but if I was that boss and if I heard that argument or excuse more than once and I found it was a lie, I'd be furious because in a sense it is hurting me because you're not telling me the truth about the kind of person you are. You're just not reliable, whatever reason you can't understand how important it is to get here. So, but I guess, again, the importance is going to lie in the eyes of the beholder. And we all have to make our own judgment as to just how white a lie is. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Yeah. It's a fair statement. And again, I prefer to focus on lies that are, again, black and also concretely observable. You can't read anybody's mind. We don't know what's going on with that person. It's really going to be very hard for you to find out whether this person is actually late because of a traffic accident or something else. So it's not worth the resources kind of to focus on these sorts of issues.
Right.
That's my perspective, kind of, and that's why I'm not making a big deal out of them.
Right, and nor should we, but I just kind of want to, address some of the audience questions that are coming in about, sort of that gray area, because we do know that we all lie during the day and we all kind of make our own decisions about when is it right and when is it wrong. And as this conversation goes on, I think you and I know for sure we're going to get into black lies, but then we're going to get to the question of, how harmful are they as opposed to, is it someone just trying to engage a little puffery for their own good? I'm looking at your table. I didn't get the chance to read your whole book. I did look through as much as I could. Fascinating, and you know I love this stuff. So one of your chapters here called "Where Do Our Mental Maps Lead Us Astray?" What were you bucking for? What's the message you were trying to get out in that chapter?
So one of the really important things to recognize about ourselves is that our vision of the world is always imperfect. It's like comparing a map to the actual reality of the territory. You know, a map is never a perfect representation of reality. And our understanding of the world is never a perfect representation of the world around us. We observe it through our senses, which are always flawed. We have our own filters and lenses, which are always flawed. And we can't fully understand other people's motivations, even though we think we can. So we have to recognize and be humble about our knowledge of the world. And that's the first step to recognizing the reality accurately, is to recognize that our perception of reality is always going to be flawed. The mental map metaphor really helps acknowledge that. So we have in our heads a certain mental map of reality, and we have to recognize that it's always going to be flawed, and there will always be areas that say, here be dragons, and so on. So that's the mental image of what is going on in their heads. And then with that humble perspective of a flawed mental map, we can work on improving that map, seeing where do we have flaws and how can we improve them. So that is the usefulness of this metaphor and this concept, which I go through in that chapter.
So in that sense, are you saying that, we'll recognize that reality is not rarely what it appears to be? So we know people lie, white lies, black lies. So Gleb, if I'm meeting you for the first time and we're having a fairly important conversation, we're not just talking about where to go for lunch, maybe I'm talking about having you on the show, which is important to me. How much should I take, you at face value when I get you on the phone for the first time? You tell me I do this and I do that. Obviously, I'm going to do a little due diligence, but should my first instinct be don't trust what I'm hearing? Or how should people approach this, that we have these flaws? We know people lie. Should our defenses go up every time we speak to someone on anything of any consequence?
I would suggest that, yes, they do go up for a couple of reasons. So the first reason is that we as human beings, our natural state is to be trusting. So that's just what the research shows about us as human beings.
Yes.
Whenever someone says something, we intuitively believe it, accept that information as accurate. So we have to train ourselves to be more skeptical and critical. And some of us, like yourself or your history with the FBI, have a lot of experience doing that. So other people don't have that nearly as much experience in being skeptical of claims that they hear, of evaluating them, of needing to fact check every claim. And so that's the first thing that we should know and be aware of, to be somewhat skeptical of whatever is coming in. And then the things that are important for you deciding whether to have me on the show, or one of your listeners deciding whether to buy a car or work with someone as a business colleague, have someone as a customer or a client, should be to evaluate, see what is important to you in making that decisions. What are your decision-making criteria? And then how can you evaluate that through the course of the conversation and through in other ways outside the context of the conversation?
Right. You bring up a couple of good points. I understand it. First, I think back to when I was a rookie police officer. And one of the first things we learned was you just don't lie. You go to court, you write someone a traffic ticket, maybe you made a little error in process or whatever. You get up there and you tell the truth. If the person gets off, the person gets off. And the reason for that being that, other than the obvious, you're a police officer, you should not lie, is that the entire system will crumble if police officers cannot be believed on the stand. And therefore, none of us want to be part, play a part in that ever happening in society. And I felt that was a really important, point to make, that other than the fact it's wrong, it has really severe consequences. And even though one can say, oh, it's just a ticket, the guy probably deserved it, that's not the point. The point is you don't lie, because it totally perverts the whole system of justice which is supposed to be based on the truth. Any comments about that?
You're absolutely very insightful about the systemic consequences of lying. And this is called in the behavioral science literature norms, maintaining informal norms. This is something that we don't tend to think about and recognize, that there are certain informal norms that maintain the whole structure of our society, whether we can trust somebody or not. I mean, think about businesses. If you're a small business owner, and I do some consulting on the side with business owners on decision making and social and emotional intelligence. So I know how business owners operate, and one of their big challenges is how do you deal with vendors who provide you with services. So if a vendor provides you with a service, let's say of $7,000, and then doesn't deliver that service, it will probably cost you more in legal fees to get back that $7,000 than the service was worth in the first place. So if you don't have an atmosphere of trust in business, if you can't trust business colleagues, vendors, and so on, that really crumbles the whole business environment. So that's an example of an informal norm that's not enforced by the courts because it would be too expensive. And so that's another example. So we know legal system, another one is business. And the whole system of democracy is actually what the research shows based on an underlying basis of trust. Without a basis of trust, democracy wouldn't function. This is one of the secret and surprising reasons why democracy is so much better than authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments take a lot of policing in order to enforce their citizens to obey the rules, to obey the laws. They have a lot of overhead. That's a lot of resources wasted. Whereas in democracy, because people are invested into the rules, are invested into the norms, then they're much more likely to comply with the laws and do things like pay taxes and many other things because they can trust their leadership to be representative and to tell them the truth, tell them the facts, and so on. So this is one of the ways that democracy works as a system.
Gleb, have you ever met anybody who has not lied on their taxes?
You know, I don't know enough about the taxes, but I can tell you that I've never lied on my taxes.
Okay,
So...
good answer. All right, good answer. All right, I'm not going to go that way. All right, but you know, we get into tribalism before, and again, there's so many topics, more questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to everything, you know, on which you're an expert. You know, we talk about, you know, tribalism. I always think about, everyone thinks about police departments as that blue wall of silence, right? That no one ever speaks, or they, you know, will lie on behalf of each other. And I think, again, that if I'm reading you correctly, I think back to my days as a police officer where that was frowned upon in strongest terms from the moment I was a rookie cop. So we want officers to be honest. We want law enforcement officers to be honest, even when it works against their best interest, because their best interests have to be our best interest. And when we don't see that, you think, again, that comes from a model, it comes from example. Do you think if the department, starting from the top on down, set the right example, we wouldn't run into these problems of officers lying or protecting one another when that protection is protecting bad behavior or, you know, or Absolutely. Something illegal?
Absolutely. So the leadership, what research on leadership shows is that the leadership sets the model and the culture for the rest of the organization. So, you know, you're never going to have a few bad apples if you don't have a few bad apples on the top. So it's right. Almost always the case that if you find a few bad apples and that it goes all the way to the top and the leadership didn't set the right example, the right control, enforcement, incentive structures to make sure that officers didn't lie at the bottom. And really, it's very harmful to have the blue wall of silence, which is unfortunately the case in some cities around the country, because that undermines the trust between the police department and the community, which of course prevents good quality policing, increases crime and lawlessness and so on, and generally undermines the quality of the law enforcement within a community. It's bad all around.
Right. And I want to go back to one thing before I get to my next point, because you brought up so many good points. You work with businessmen on decision making, and really what you and I do tend to overlap, because when I work with businesses, it's the decision making I'm trying to help them with is more to avoid fraud. So I always try to teach, have a jaundiced eye, go something with professional skepticism. And no matter how much you think you trust somebody, you do your due diligence, because as you said, trying to sue to get your money back is more expensive than whatever you lost. My message is always, once that money leaves your hand, you're never seeing it again. Yeah, I don't even recommend trying to go to court, because you never see that money, and it's the torture it puts you through. So again, we tend to want to trust. That's a natural ability. I think we see it because we want to see it. We want to close a business deal. We want to profit. Are these, some of the flaws that you think specifically give rise to fraud and, white collar theft? The kind of stuff I would be working on with the business.
Yes, absolutely. So excessive trust, excessive confidence. Some of the big problems that come are when people perceive excessive tribal affinity. And there's a specific cognitive bias called halo effect, where a halo effect, a little halo refers to, like a little angel, refers to when we like one characteristic of somebody, then we like all of their other characteristics too much. So I can go back to the Buckeyes example, So I'm here at Ohio State University, I'm a professor, I'm contractually obligated to root for the Buckeyes, go Bucks, right? So if somebody is going to be also a Buckeye fan, that will make me like them excessively, too much, and trust them too much. So that is going to be a problem, and you need to be especially suspicious if somebody, not because that person is intuitively bad or in some way, but because you will tend to like that person too much if the person shares some of your characteristics. So you want to be especially careful if somebody shares some of your characteristics, your sociocultural background, goes to the same college, shares, has the same name even, or something like that. Those things should make you more suspicious than you would tend to be otherwise.
Right. And when I give my presentations within corporations about their internal controls, I talk about that a lot because who do we like the most? We like ourselves. So, Absolutely. Someone like us, we're going to like a lot. And I hate to say this about my old employer, but it's in my first book, Walking the Corporate Beat. I try to be very honest, but that was a problem within the FBI. We had a promotional process that, despite all the trappings on it, it was strictly who you liked, and that's why I tend to always be certain people always kind of falling into the a certain description because they promoted who they liked. It didn't mean these people necessarily were good leaders. You could be a great FBI investigator, doesn't mean you know how to run a squad or run an office. And as someone who was in executive management, I could say that one of the weakest parts of the FBI was the management because we relied on people we liked, and we just tend to like people who are like us. And I think that's just an inherent weakness in any organization that doesn't have strict internal controls to make sure that's avoided.
This is something I often consult on diversity and inclusion. And one of the things I strongly stress is the importance of having diverse teams with diverse cognitive abilities. People who don't think in the same ways. That's really what the research shows from people like James Surowiecki, Wisdom of the Crowds, that having people with diverse cognitive perspectives in the highest levels of leadership gives you the best decision-making processes and has the best outcomes for businesses going forward.
Oh, I agree. When I was in executive management, especially in the last years in the bureau, I took over an office. I told my management staff, the last thing I want is a yes man. Please, I want to have a conversation here. Tell me what you think. Disagree with me. No brownie points here for saying yes, boss. I want to hear some difference of opinions. Of course, how else could you make an intelligent, informed decision if you don't hear another point of view? And what's wrong with going with someone else's point of view? Yeah. And what's wrong with being wrong? If you say something and someone corrects it, what's wrong with saying, "Oh, my mistake"? I don't know why we have such a hard time with that. Let's go on to something else here. All right. Let's talk about why we listen to lie. We said, it's inherent. We trust people. Is there anything else in the way a lie is delivered And I'm going to go to another point here before I forget it, because you brought up where the source of the lie is. And we talked about people in positions of power. And I know that I look at that, and I guess you could tell where the conversation's heading, but I look at that from cases I'm working now, even in retirement, of wrongful convictions. How do we get, it's so hard to convict somebody anyway, when you look at it from the law enforcement perspective. We have all these criminal procedure laws. We have evidence that can be quashed. You have to, convince every member of that jury beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a very high bar to hit. So you think, how could people be wrongfully convicted? But the reason it happens is because when a prosecutor stands up there and says, he did it, and you have a police officer, an FBI agent say, yes, my investigation says he did it, they may not be lying, but they're making statements that they may not necessarily know for sure, unless they actually witnessed it. And isn't that statement of authority, even though it may not be a lie, isn't that interpreted as correct because of the source of the information?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so there's a phenomenon called emotional contagion, where people who are in positions of authority infect others with their emotions. So if they show a strong degree of confidence in their statement, then people who are in positions of subordinate positions, or in generally have less authority, will tend to believe these statements more than if these statements came from somebody without that authority. And so they carry that emotional punch with their statements that makes their statements believed to a greater extent than they should be. And that's a very unfortunate consequence of authority, because that sometimes people with authority use that to manipulate us, to make us believe in falsehoods, or make us believe in statements that they don't fully support for their own purpose.
Right. And I think exactly these are cases where people just make a statement and people tend to believe them because they are in power, which is why I think we have to be so careful in how we exercise the power and the things we say. So let's talk about the liar. All right, let's talk about the black liar. Okay? There's someone who just says things outright lying, knowing they're lying, and don't care about anything. Do you have sort of a profile of that person? Do they fit into a certain personality profile? Or what can you tell us about those kind of people?
Sure. So those kinds of people we have to remember that they're always going to perceive themselves as heroes in their own story. So that's the first thing to understand. They're not going to perceive themselves as bad guys, even though we might perceive them as bad guys. So they always believe that they have a certain motivation for their lie that outweighs the negativity of lying. They may not even perceive lying as negative, as something bad. They might just perceive it as a tool, a strategy to achieve the certain outcomes they want. So someone who is going to be basically lack a sense of ethics is a first aspect of that profile. Someone who will not perceive lying as unethical. And that's a thing that we can observe from that person's other activities. Does that person have an ethical stance? Does the person show ethical qualms in other areas of her or his life? And if they don't, then that can tell us that, okay, this person is quite likely to engage in freewheeling lying, and we should be especially cautious of trusting anything that they say.
Okay, and I'm going to get more into lying in a second, the direction we're going, but I want to get to one of the questions being asked. They want to know, do you think that someone who lies, again, in your terms of lying, is someone who's more likely to steal or commit other crimes?
Absolutely. I mean, lying, what I said, if that person lacks ethical qualms, then of course they're going to be lacking them in other domains. Lying is just one domain. Stealing, doing other things, everything that's falls under the category of harming other people, they will be much more likely to do if they engage in lying that harms other people, in black lies.
Okay, and there's another question here, again, goes to sort of a real psychology. Someone wants to know, do sociopaths lie because they like it and they like being manipulative, or is it because they are just selfish, or is it a combination of things?
So sociopaths, the basic reason they lie is because they don't care about hurting other people. The basic definition of sociopathy is not having a concern for other people's feelings, for other people's emotions. So the fundamental reason that sociopaths lie so much is because they don't care about themselves, them hurting other people. Now, they might have other motivations, manipulating or so on, but the overarching reason, so the answer to that question, is because they don't care. If lying achieves their goal, they'll lie. If telling the truth achieves their goal, they'll tell the truth. They just don't see a difference.
Okay, so they don't care, right?
About the consequence.
So they're not lying they don't gain a sort of great feeling, some high out of it, feeling I manipulated you, I lied to you, I made a fool of you. It's just a means to an end.
For
right?
Sociopaths, broadly speaking, yes. There might be some sociopaths who like to manipulate people, but that doesn't describe sociopaths. That's a subcategory of sociopaths. Sociopaths as a broader category that wouldn't apply to them.
Okay, and now we're going to get into the topic that we knew we have to get into, and that's the current state of affairs with President Trump. And before we go on, I want to address people in the audience who are going to think, oh, is this just an anti-Trump rant? And it's not. And Dr. Tsipursky and I talked about this in advance. This is not meant to attack Donald Trump, but we do have to address the issue of lying. He is the president of the United States. I know there's been other presidents who lied. Nixon's lied. Reagan's lied. Bill Clinton's famous lie. Obama got hammered for, if you like your plan, you could keep it. Yes, Hillary lied. But right now, they are not president of the United States. What they say or said does not matter. So we just want to deal with the issue that we do have a president who lies a lot. He lies, the depth of his lying is beyond the scope of what we've seen. Gleb, would you agree with that this is not what we've seen before in terms of politicians lying? We're dealing with sort of a new beast?
Yes, I think when we look at previous politicians lying in modern history, at least, we have never seen this extent of lying. And it's not simply, probably looking back at all the presidents in the history of the United States, we would not see any president who lies casually. I mean, there are plenty of presidents who lie strategically, but they lie in certain specific instances that is meant to accomplish their goals. When we see Donald Trump, he lies casually. He makes obvious false statements that are easily disprovable. So this is really a different beast, I would agree with you, than many previous presidents who made very strategic, deceptive statements, lies.
Right, and generally, Nixon wanted to lie about, of course, Watergate. Bill Clinton wanted to lie about, I never had sex with that woman. And it was sort of to promote themselves, save face, whatever. But you're saying a lot of Donald Trump's lies seem to serve no purpose.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
At least on the surface. Yeah.
Yes, they serve absolutely no purpose, and they're very easily disprovable. I mean, he says things, he makes deceptive statements, false statements. Then there are videos of him saying the exact opposite thing, and then he doesn't acknowledge that there are videos of him saying the exact opposite thing that he said previously. So it's strange to observe that, and strange to consider why he might be doing these things, why he might be saying things that are just completely contradictory in many cases and really irrelevant. They're not really impacting the body public in any significant manner.
So those lies, do you consider those white lies?
Oh gosh, no. I mean, they're quite harmful. As the president of the United States, every statement that he makes relates to norms. So we talked a little bit about norms in democracy. Democracy functions on the basis of trust. That is the fundamental basis of democracy. And every time the president of the United States lies, whether it happens to be Trump, happens to be Nixon, happens to be Clinton, happens to be Obama, that trust is undermined. So whatever president you have who lies, that's really harmful for trust in American society. Now, so whenever Trump lies, anytime he lies, he undermines trust. People believe in democracy less. They are less willing to comply with laws and pay taxes and do everything else. Then there's more need for overhead, and our society, our whole system gets a little bit weaker and shakier and less stable.
Okay, he's a president of the United States. He wanted to lead this country. Why does he lie and then have the effect that you're describing now? Why does he do it?
It's very hard for me to understand his motivations for the casual lies. For the big lies, I mean, it's obvious that he wants to achieve his goals. He wants to fool people. And you can see that a lot of his base, his supporters, buy his lies. They accept them at face value. Part of the reason for that is because we have a broken information ecosystem. Trump can now reach his base through Twitter and through Facebook and other means, through social media, basically. So research on social media shows that about 2/3 of Americans get news from social media. About 20% or so get most of their news from social media. And trust in mainstream media has really, really greatly decreased, especially among Republicans, since Trump took office. So since Trump began running the presidential campaign from 2015 to 2016, trust among Republicans in mainstream media has fallen by more than half, whereas it remained stable from 2000 to 2015. From 2015 to 2016, it fell by more than half. So Trump is elevating social media, his own communication, positioning himself as the voice of legitimacy and truth, and undermining mainstream media so that his base trusts him as the sole voice of authority. So that's understandable. I'm not sure why he makes the casual lies. That just doesn't compute for me. I'm not sure.
Okay, but you said what he's doing, he's sort of making himself the voice of authority. You and I just recently, in the last few minutes, discussed the power of something stated by someone in power, the effect it could have. So you say that's why he's doing it. He's doing it because it works. But it's not quite that innocuous, is it? I mean, this has consequences, does it not?
It's incredibly damaging for American democracy. So if you think about it, imagine a leader, whether Trump or not, who gets people to believe every statement that he makes, which is how Trump's base currently treat him, that they believe every statement he makes is accurate. Now, that leader, he can lie to you about whether he's corrupt or not. And he can stuff his pockets with all of your money, all of the taxpayer money, and you wouldn't know it because he can lie about it when he's caught out by the mainstream media as being corrupt. You wouldn't know it because obviously he wouldn't say that he's corrupt if he's corrupt, right? So
I'm not a crook, right? I'm not a crook.
Right, I'm not a crook, exactly. So you have no idea if he is stuffing his pockets with your money. That's one. Second, if this person says that, oh, I got millions of illegal votes were cast for my opponent, and therefore I really won the election. So that can come up, in the next election cycle if Trump happens to lose. Now, if you trust every word that he says, regardless of whether millions of votes were cast for illegal votes were cast for his opponent or not, you'll trust that. You'll believe it. And therefore, that's how authoritarianism happens. That's the classical takeover of authoritarianism. That's what happened in many other countries around the world when authoritarian dictators took over from democracies. So attacking the freedom of the press and the election process, which we see happening right now under Trump. So regardless of whether you support Trump or not, these efforts to undermine the free media and the electoral process should be very worrying. If any president, Democratic or Republican, does anything like that, that hammers the death nails into the coffin of democracy.
But it works, does it not? What he's doing works for him?
Absolutely. It works very effectively. So in the same way that for police officers who would lie in court, it would work because for them, they would get, more people convicted and their score would go up with their superior officers, right? Because presumably they get more people convicted and they're perceived as effective. So, but they undermine the whole system. So it works for Trump individually, just as it would work for a police officer individually, but it would undermine the whole system. So the whole system is unquestionably undermined when Trump lies, as it would be undermined if a single police officer lied. Of course, the president lying is much more impactful. It's like the chief of police for the whole nation lying.
Right, good analogy there. And you know, not one of the dangers, but some of the dangers here, as he keeps lying, because Trump, even in his own book, you know, talked about repeating lies. And long before his book, you know, I heard, as I'm sure a lot of people had, the axiom: you keep telling a lie, sooner or later people believe it. But you know, now I'm reading an article here. I just got off Politico, and you know, quotes from certain researchers: when we are overwhelmed with false or potentially false statements, our brains pretty quickly become so overworked that we stop trying to sift through everything. So I would imagine that the more he talks, he does that because he knows that sooner or later we're going to say, okay, already, I'm not going to, you know, start sifting through it. What he says is good enough because I just can't handle trying to decide what's true and not. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's a phenomenon, there's a specific phenomenon called illusory truth effect. So it doesn't quite function quite that way. How it functions is when you are exposed to a statement that you are confused by or surprised by, you have a strong emotional reaction to it. Now, when you keep being exposed to that statement over and over again, your emotional reaction fades. Each time it's smaller. And so over time, you have a smaller and smaller emotional reaction to a statement that's repeated more and more and more. And so because you don't have any strong emotional reaction to it anymore, you perceive it as accurate. You're comfortable with it. So human beings, one of the fundamental problems that we have as human beings is that we perceive what we're comfortable with as true, as accurate. And so that's something we should be very suspicious about. When we're very comfortable with something, we should be checking it, especially to go against our native, intuitive desire to perceive something that's comfortable as true. And so that's how the illusory truth effect works. When someone repeats something many, many, many times, that is how a lie becomes ingrained as a truth in someone's consciousness.
Another one of those cognitive biases that we talked about, right?
Exactly.
And here's just one more point, then I want to get onto some of the questions coming in here. Actually, only have a few more minutes. Here's another quote I'm taking from this article. It's not my quote. It's easy enough to correct minor false facts if they aren't crucial to your sense of self. Alas, nothing political fits into that bucket. I think it's obvious. We all look at our political affiliation as defining who we are. Are we right? Are we left? Are we liberal, conservative, law and order? You know, not, you know, bleeding heart, whatever you want to call it, good or bad. And when we make a decision, Levin, I'm looking for your, you know, feelings on this, such as I support this candidate or this candidate represents my political beliefs, we don't want to accept the bad, but we don't want to accept the fact that they're lying. What he's saying sounds good, like you said, is comfortable for us. It reaffirms who we are. It makes it that much more difficult to recognize that as a lie. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. So this is one of the biggest challenges that the article identifies with politics in the specific. When we specifically are confronted with an issue, oh, I like that candidate, and this candidate might have lied, well, I'm going to ignore this lie. That's a really problematic issue of politics. And so that's what one of the projects that I'm deeply involved with, the Pro-Truth Pledge, is about. The Pro-Truth Pledge at protruthpledge.org works to counteract this tendency by getting us to commit to truthful behaviors in advance and encouraging politicians to commit to truthful behaviors in advance. So the Pro-Truth Pledge is a set of 12 behaviors like fact-checking information to confirm it's true and celebrating people who change their minds, retracting information that's found to be incorrect. And research shows if we commit to a pledge like this in advance of engaging with a political situation or a political candidate, we're much more likely to stay truthful, to orient toward the truth. That's one. And second, the more people go to protruthpledge.org and sign the pledge, the more incentives politicians will have and public figures of all sorts will have to sign it. So we want politicians to be committed to it as well. And that's one of the
wonderful.
major projects.
That would be wonderful.
That we're, yes, and there are already over 80 politicians who took the Pro-Truth Pledge because their constituents signed it and asked the politicians to sign it as well.
And give us that website again, please.
protruthpledge.org, protruthpledge.org.
Actually, now we've got a few minutes left. We try to keep this in the hour. And I guess the good news, we won't get to all the questions because there's so many, but some of the questions coming in have to do with lie detection. Can we tell when people lie? I know you said you have a little expertise in that. I see people giving these seminars all the time, and one of the famous clips they always show is Bill Clinton saying, "I did not have sex with that woman." They say, "Look at this facial expression and that." Gleb, can we look at these microfacial expressions and determine if someone is lying to us?
We really can't in the vast majority of cases. It takes a great deal of training. What we usually detect, and what things like lie detectors detect, is signs of anxiety. So that's what they actually detect. They detect anxiety. Those micro gestures are not gestures of lies, they're gestures of anxiety. So we know that sometimes we can have anxiety because we lie, or sometimes anxiety happens because somebody lies. Sometimes anxiety happens because the person, is worried about his mom in the hospital, or maybe their leg really itches and they're like, "Oh, should I itch my leg and lose some social status in this situation?" So it's really very difficult to tell whether someone's experiencing anxiety and for what reason. Well, it's not difficult to tell whether someone's experiencing anxiety, but it's very difficult to tell the reason for why someone is experiencing anxiety. So only someone with really a lot of training and a lot of experience can discern between whether the person is experiencing anxiety because she's lying or because of all the other various factors that may lead to anxiety through appropriate questioning and so on.
Right, and I've looked at some of the research that was done, and I'm not an expert researcher, but just based on my experience, I have a lot of doubts about it because I've seen where the viewer is supposed to pick out liars based on certain the microfacial expressions. They look up to the left or something like that, and when they look at these scenarios, somewhere in there are people who are going to have made that expression, so they know to look for it. But we would have to, to make this statistically significant, would we not? I mean, you're a researcher, I imagine, determine how many times do people make that expressions when they're not lying, right? In order to determine if it's just an expression of some people or a few people, or if it just doesn't mean anything. I don't think there's been enough research to make that determination, correct?
Absolutely, yes. From what I know about the research, this stuff is not supported by research, and this is one of the reasons why lie detectors aren't used as credible evidence in court trials. So I would strongly discourage people from believing that lie training seminars will actually lead to them being able to tell whether someone is lying.
Right. It's based on experience, folks. They never did use that stuff in the FBI. We were pretty good. 1 minute left, Gleb. Someone asked me two questions. They asked me about the book I mentioned by me, but you're our guest. Tell us about your books first.
Sure. So the Truth Seeker's Handbook, a science-based guide, forms the basis for much of this conversation. And this book gets you to help you recognize how to figure out the truth and avoid cognitive biases to make good decisions, and also how to guide other people into helping them make good decisions and avoid these kind of cognitive biases that we've talked about on the show.
Fantastic. And I'm going to spell out your name, Dr. Gleb, G-L-E-B, Tsipursky, T-S-I-P-U-R-S-K-Y. Look him up on Amazon.com, find his books. And thank you for asking about my books. The one I mentioned today was called Walking the Corporate Beat, Police School for Business People. Discussed a lot of the type of things we discussed today, the cognitive biases, flaws in our thinking processes that affect how we do business, what leaves us vulnerable to crime and fraud. And I used a lot of stories from my years on the police department and the FBI. Gleb, thank you so much. You're a great guest. We had a tremendous turnout, a lot of questions. I hope to continue the conversation with you sometime in the future.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. And thank you, everybody, for joining us again. Next week, we're going to be discussing workplace violence with an expert who will tell us about the warning signs and the environment that lead to workplace violence. Next month, we have the whole month scheduled out already. As I said, if you know someone or you fall in the category of being a reformed criminal or a victim of cyberbullying, please contact us at crimesandtimes@gmail.com if you're interested in appearing on the show. Great night tonight. Thank you, everybody. See you next week.